welcome to the Explainer. We're going to tackle one of the biggest questions there is. How exactly does your brain take all the chaos from the outside world and turn it into your personal reality? So, let's start with a question. And on the surface, it sounds pretty simple. How does something that happens in a split second, like a flash of light, how does that become a memory that can stick with you for a lifetime? Something that actually shapes how you think and feel. Well, over the next few minutes, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to follow that incredible journey right through the architecture of your mind. All right, so our story, it starts in what you could call a storm of sensation. This is the very first moment that the outside world makes contact with your nervous system. And it all kicks off with something super simple. Picture this, a boy in a park and he sees a colored disc. That one little sight, that's the trigger. It sets off this huge cascading chain of events inside his brain. Okay, so the path from the world into your brain is a physical one. First, light from that disc enters the eye and hits the retina. Now, the retina's job is to act like a translator, turning that light into electrical signals. And those signals, they get sent zipping along the optic nerve straight to the brain. But here's the key thing. At this point, it's all just raw, meaningless data. It's static. So how does all that raw static become something we actually recognize? Well, that brings us to Act 2, what I like to call the brain's first draft. This is where your brain stops just passively receiving information and starts actively interpreting it. And that right there is the magic of perception. It's really important to get this. Sensation by itself is just noise. It's random flashes, random sounds. But perception? That's where your brain steps in and starts to create meaning. Think of it this way. Your brain isn't a passive camera just recording what's out there. No, it's an active artist, and it's constantly trying to paint a picture that makes sense out of all that chaos. All right, so let's put that artistic brain of yours to the test right now. Take a good look at this image. What animal do you see? Now, at first glance, what you're really seeing is just, well, a bunch of abstract black and white patches, right? It's that sensory noise we were talking about. Your brain is getting all these little fragments, and it has to figure out, okay, what do I do with this stuff? But almost instantly, your brain gets to work. It starts filling in the gaps, connecting the dots based on everything you've ever seen before. And for most of us, an image of a Dalmatian dog just kind of pops out of the chaos. This is a perfect example of a psychological principle called closure. Your brain is hardwired to see complete, familiar things even when the data's missing. You don't just see the dog, you build it. Now, this whole idea of actively building reality, it's not just for figuring out what objects are. It also totally shapes how we perceive things like size and distance. And because our brain is constantly making these little assumptions, its interpretation can be really, really easy to trick. Let's check out a classic example, the Ponzo illusion. So, the question is simple enough. Which of these two red bars is bigger? I mean, if you're like pretty much everyone else, that top bar looks way longer than the bottom one, right? Well, guess what? They are exactly the same size. So why the illusion? It's because your brain sees those converging lines and immediately thinks depth, like railroad tracks heading off into the distance. It makes an assumption the top bar must be farther away, so your brain helpfully makes it look bigger to compensate. See? Your brain isn't just seeing, it's constantly calculating. And in this case, it just got the math a little bit wrong. Okay, so our brain has sensed something, and it's perceived what that thing is. But the process is far from over. That brings us to Act 3, adding color and feeling. This is the part where an experience stops being generic and becomes uniquely personal to you. The thing is, perception is never neutral. Your brain doesn't just stop at, oh, that's a rose. It immediately asks a much deeper question. What does this rose mean to me? And it instantly starts connecting what you're seeing to this huge internal library of all your memories and emotions. And that connection, it can happen in a couple different ways. Seeing that rose might trigger what we call an episodic memory. That's a specific, personal story, like, I remember the day my grandma gave me my first rose. Or it could just trigger your somatic memory. That's your general factual knowledge, like roses are a type of flowering shrub. So you've got a personal story versus a fact file. And both of them make the experience richer.
But what's the point of all this intense processing if it just disappears? Well, it doesn't. Every single experience you have actively rewires your brain, teaching it lessons for the future. And that brings us to Act 4, Lessons Learned.
One of the most fundamental ways our brains learn is through association. You've probably heard of Pavlov's famous experiments, right? By ringing a bell right before he gave a dog food, over and over, he actually taught the dog's brain to connect the two things. And pretty soon, just the sound of the bell, all by itself, was enough to make the dog salivate. A totally neutral sound was rewired in the brain to create a physical response. This really highlights two big ways we learn. You've got that automatic association, which is classical conditioning, like with Pavlov's dog, but we also learn actively through something called operant conditioning. That's basically learning from rewards and consequences. You know, like a kid learning not to touch a hot stove, or a student figuring out that studying gets them better grades. Our brains are just wired to learn both ways, automatically and on purpose. So let's bring this all home in our final act. Your personal reality. We've just traced the entire journey of a simple flash of light, watching it gain meaning, emotion, and real significance. We literally watched it become real. So this is the journey that every single one of your experiences takes, and it happens in a fraction of a second. Your mind zips through these 4 stages. It starts with sensation, just taking in the raw data. Then comes perception, giving that data meaning. Next is resonance, connecting that meaning to your unique emotions and memories. And it all wraps up with learning, where the experience actually physically changes your brain for the future. So in the end, the big takeaway is this. Our experience of the world isn't something we just passively watch. The real truth is, you don't just see the world, you build it, every single moment. This isn't just some abstract psychology idea. It's the actual blueprint of your life. Your reality isn't a photograph of what's out there. It's a one-of-a-kind masterpiece painted by your own brain. And that leaves us with one last, really fascinating question to think about. If every single one of us is building our own unique reality, then how much of what we experience do we ever truly share?